Unfortunately for Nixon, while he did have several successes in foreign affairs, his administration will probably be most remembered for the Watergate scandal. To provide a bit of background to the Watergate scandal, I'd like to begin by defining some terms. The first of these would be CREEP. This stood for the Committee to Re-elect the President. There was nothing sinister in creating such a committee, but it turns out that CREEP was involved in several illegal activities. Nixon appointed his Attorney General, John Mitchell, to head this group. Nixon never forgot his very close loss to John Kennedy in 1960 and let it be known he wanted to leave no stone unturned to ensure his re-election in 1972. I'd like to mention two other terms. The plumbers were a subgroup of CREEP. Initially, they were created to stop leaks of confidential information. At one point, they broke into the psychiatrist office of Daniel Ellsberg in hopes of finding information which would damage his reputation. Ellsberg became a target after he leaked confidential information to the New York Times. Dirty tricks were the nickname for a series of actions undertaken by the plumbers to discredit Nixon's opponents and cause chaos within the Democratic Party. You can click on the hyperlinks below to find out more background information about Watergate and dirty tricks. This is called the Watergate scandal because in the summer of 1972, several members of the Plumbers Unit broke into the Democratic headquarters located in the Watergate office and hotel complex. They were caught in an attempt to discover the Democrats' strategy for the upcoming election. Nixon probably didn't know about the plans for the break-in ahead of time, but once he found out, he didn't go public. Instead, he tried to cover up the links between the plumbers who were arrested and his campaign. He also interfered with the FBI's investigation of those who were arrested. There are a lot of people who deserve credit for investigating the break-in and putting the pieces together in the whole Watergate scandal. Two of these individuals were Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, both of whom worked for the Washington Post. The two writers were helped by an anonymous source nicknamed Deep Throat. This mysterious source gave clues to both Woodward and Bernstein over time. The true identity of Deep Throat was unknown for 30 years. In the summer of 2005, Mark Felt came forward and admitted he was the mystery man. In the 1970s, he had been a top official with the FBI. In the midst of reporting over Watergate, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, was forced to resign after it was discovered he had accepted bribes. Nixon then appointed a new vice president to take over following Agnew's resignation. He chose Gerald R. Ford. Ford was a veteran of Congress and a well-respected member of the House of Representatives. As members of Congress investigated the scandal, it was discovered that a taping system had been installed in the White House. Prosecutors eventually acquired access to those tapes. Even though one included a mysterious 18-minute gap, the tapes clearly showed the president had ordered the cover-up and obstructed justice. With the House of Representatives poised to impeach him, Nixon became the first president to resign on August 9, 1974. Once Nixon's resignation took effect, Gerald Ford became the new president. In a move which surprised many, in September of 1974, Ford issued a pardon of former President Nixon for any and all crimes he may have committed while in office. Nixon left office with a very mixed legacy. First of all, he showed tremendous foresight in foreign affairs. He demonstrated he was a true statesman by overlooking his past views concerning communism and establishing an entirely new outlook in American foreign policy. However, trust in politicians was completely shattered. Furthermore, the tapes and subsequent investigations revealed the Watergate break-in was just one in a series of abuses of power by the Nixon White House. Among other things, an enemies list developed by Nixon was revealed, as well as the administration's use of government agencies to harass opponents. The tapes also showed a president who used racial slurs directed towards African Americans and Jews. Many Americans began to ask, is the United States becoming a second-rate world power? Gerald Ford failed to win re-election as he was defeated by a politician from Georgia. The man who won the presidential election of 1976 was Jimmy Carter. It was in the backdrop of Watergate that a Washington outsider, Jimmy Carter, became president in 1977. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy and had served on nuclear submarines. He then returned home to Plains, Georgia, to farm, and was later elected governor. He was an attractive candidate who pledged he would never lie to the American people and described himself as a born-again Christian. high point of Carter's presidency probably came when he successfully forged a peace agreement in the Middle East. Let's begin with some background. In 1948, Israel declared its independence. Arab nations protested, and this led to the First Arab-Israeli War. In 1967, the Six-Day War took place. During this war, Israel captured the Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, and West Bank. This was followed by the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. Egypt and Syria attacked territories controlled by Israel as a result of the Six-Day War. Initially, the attacks were successful, but then Israel regained control over these territories. Carter hoped to bring peace to the region, so he called upon the leaders of both Egypt and Israel to meet at the President's Retreat, Camp David. The result was the Camp David Accords. In this agreement, Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel's government. In return, Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. It was hoped that this agreement between Israel and a Muslim nation would lay the foundation for future peace in the entire region. We'll now explore some of the troubles which unfortunately plagued the Carter administration. One of the troubles facing the nation in the 1970s was an energy crisis. As you can see from this chart, beginning in the 1970s, the price of gasoline skyrocketed. In 1970, it averaged about 35 cents a gallon. By 1979, it was about $1 a gallon. The increase in gas prices further influenced inflation. I had previously talked about problems with inflation linked to Nixon's policies. Well, the problems continued after he left office. When Carter ran for election in 1976, he talked about the so-called misery index. This figure represented the levels of inflation plus unemployment. In 1976, he described the misery index as unacceptable. Well, by 1980, it had gotten worse, as shown by these statistics. Economic woes were followed by a foreign policy crisis with Iran in 1979. From the early 1950s onward, the United States had supported the Shah in Iran as the nation's leader because he supported the United States even though he was repressive. In 1979, a revolution replaced the Shah with a religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini preached hatred of the United States. In November of 1979, 53 Americans were taken hostage in Iran. The following April, a rescue attempt failed, leaving 8 servicemen dead. The hostages were not returned for nearly 450 days, not until Carter left office in 1981. Many began to question the leadership of Carter in a crisis, and some began to wonder if the United States was becoming a second-rate world power. That concludes the bulk of the lecture, but I would like to talk about some concluding ideas. The latter half of this lecture addressed the presidency of Jimmy Carter. However, the bulk of the issues discussed covered some of the successes and failures of Richard Nixon's presidency. There are 2 ideas you might want to consider. First, was the legacy of Richard Nixon's administration positive or negative for the nation? Secondly, following the American loss in Vietnam, a presidential resignation, economic woes, and a hostage crisis, by 1980, was the United States becoming a second-rate world power? Both of these questions are for you to decide. This concludes lecture number 15. However, the next few slides will offer hyperlinks to more information as well as sources used for this lecture. Have a great day.